All right, I made this short video in preparation for the political strategy meeting tomorrow, but I hope it will also be useful for everyone who's wondering where we're at right now with our third demand, although we will be publishing more information on this in the next days, I'm sure. Just quick info, this picture is from the Rebellion Week in October, where we hosted a People's Assembly in the Milieu Defense headquarters. And it's one of the biggest projects we did so far in connection with our third demand. So before we start, I just want to give a little analogy about crisis. So in what situations can we speak of a crisis? And I always point out that there's a combination important. If we have a good captain, but stormy weather, then there's not really a crisis because the crew would not ask for change, because even though there's an emergency outside going on, the captain that they have is the best that they can get. If there's a shitty captain, but the water is calm, then there's also not a crisis, because the captain might be shitty, but there's no point of appointing a new one. So there are two examples that I want to show in which the crisis has led to the establishment of a citizens' assembly or something similar. There's the case of Iceland and there's the case of Belgium. In Iceland, in the aftermath of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, the pots and pans uprising happened. The people realized that their government is not just corrupt, but also that the status quo is not acceptable anymore. The financial crisis created a lot of debt and a lot of very precarious situations for the people. But next to the pots and pans uprising, they also organized the Ante, a broad coalition of people in society who asked for a change in the democratic system. So they organized all kinds of bottom-up participatory processes that became more structured over the time, and ultimately led to the creation of something very similar to citizens' assemblies. And later on, also the government adopted the idea and established a citizens' assembly on the topic of the change of the constitution. The projects were not successful in the end, so the constitution was not changed based on the input, but it's a very strong example. Then there's the case of Belgium, where there was an election crisis, also some years after the financial crisis, where the government after the elections was not able to form, well, a regering, an actual government, and for more than 500 days, the country was basically frozen because there was no governance going on. So this case really exposed the incapacity of the current democratic system of Belgium to govern effectively. And so as a response to this, some people, David van Rijbroek, one of the guiding people there, came up with G1000, a group of people that pushed for more participatory democracy. And over the years, these ideas became stronger and stronger. And now in the East Belgian part, the German-speaking part, the province, the Citizens' Assembly is now part of the constitution of that province. The crisis that we talk about in Extinction Rebellion is, of course, the environmental crisis. So there we have a lot of different stories that we tell and a lot of facts that we offer for the rough sea, basically. But we also have a lot of different stories why the government is failing, why the representative democracy is not able to deal with this crisis, for example, because of short-termism, because politicians need to get re-elected, so they can't make decisions that are uncomfortable in the next few years, because then they don't get re-elected. So they're not able to have this long-term horizon. But there's also the story of corporate takeover, of neoliberalism, of big companies deciding what our governments do and basically undermine democracy. So there's really two different stories, or like more stories that we have for these two different aspects of the crisis. But in any case, whatever these stories are, we offer the Citizens' Assembly as the way out, as the star on the horizon that we want to walk towards. And now the question is, what is the Citizens' Assembly specifically? And there I want to distinguish between a couple of concepts that we can really agree on, that are kind of common sense, that are really reappear basically in the literature and by different movements, and topics that we don't agree on yet as Extinction Rebellion, as a movement here in the Netherlands. So a Citizens' Assembly, the way we want it, would be mandated by the national government. So it would engage with national legislation. The representation, so the membership of the Citizens' Assembly, would be guaranteed through stratified random sampling. So there would be a random selection of citizens, and in addition to this selection process of this sampling, there would be a process of stratification through which it would be ensured that certain demographics would be represented in the same percentages as in society. Less complicated, take for example, let's say there are 50% women and 50% men in society, then the stratification process would make sure that there would be 50% women and 50% men also in the citizens' assembly. How exactly that works, I don't want to go into right now, but this is the process of stratification, and you can do this with different categories as well. So you can do this with sex, gender, masculine, feminine mostly, because this is what we have data for. But also, for example, where people live, age categories, levels of education, or in the UK, for example, they take the political attitude, for example, if people voted for or against Brexit. So there are different categories. Then the people who would sit in the Citizens' Assembly, they would get information or input from experts in the field and from stakeholders. So people who can either affect the decision or would be affected by the decision. Let's say people who work in the fossil fuel industry are stakeholders because they would be very much affected by the transition, but also the fossil fuel industry or other companies would give input because they can affect the implementation of future legislations. After this input phase, there would be deliberation. So the members of the Citizens' Assembly would not automatically make decisions or vote, but first there would be sufficient time, that's the next one also, to talk about this. And importantly, we use the word deliberation, not discussion, because it's about a joint effort to find a solution and not a competition in which you try to convince the other about the correctness of your position. And this deliberation you can ensure through a process of facilitation. So there would be sufficient time for this process of deliberation, but also for the input phase. And then the Citizens' Assembly, the members would make a decision. The whole process is organized by an independent organizer, and that's important. So the mandate would come from the government, but the government would not run the Citizens' Assembly, but an independent organizer would do so. And then the Citizens' Assembly would have to have high visibility and high transparency so that it can actually affect the public discussion in society about the issues, about the climate crisis. If the Citizens' Assembly happens somewhere in the back door of a small building and doesn't really have this visibility and this grandeur, if you want, then it would not gain legitimacy in society. So visibility and transparency are important. Then what we don't agree on, a major one, is what is the exact mandate of the Citizens' Assembly. So that there's two aspects. How exactly would the Citizens' Assembly affect the legislative and the administrative system? Would, for example, a decision by the Citizens' Assembly be binding, or would it be advisory, or something in between? There's a lot of gray area in between. Under what conditions would the decisions of the Citizens' Assembly be binding, and so on. But also, what is the exact question that the Citizens' Assembly gets posed? Would it be as broad as how do we deal with the climate crisis? Or would it be more narrow in the sense of how do we transform the agricultural system? So there is unclarity, and we don't have a clear position on this as Extinction Bay Netherlands. And then the other point is, how granular do we want to be? So how detailed do we want to be with the position of XR? And what I mean with this point, I just want to show this slide, taking the example of random sampling. And just kind of put the spectrum there. On the left side, we have very little granularity, a very coarse position that Extinction Bayern could have on what random sampling means, or very fine position. So on the left side, we have something like all members of the Citizens' Assembly are selected by lot, so by sampling. And this sentence or this position would be would not be very detailed. On the other side, we have something like we define clearly the number of participants that would be selected, and we would define what data pool the citizens would be selected from, who counts as a citizen, what exactly is the selection mechanism. You can go into very much detail there. And so this would be a very fine position. And both poles of the spectrum have, of course, the benefits and the detriments. A coarse position has the benefit that it's a very simple story. You can tell it very easily. You can package it in graphics and in videos and in presentations, stories, whatever. And so the idea can spread very easily. It can be picked up by other movements, by politicians, by all kinds of people. And it also gives flexibility to politicians, so they don't have the feeling that they have to agree with a whole big package deal, but they can actually still make decisions themselves, which especially for people who are used to making decisions might be an important point to agree to a position of a group that tries to change their position. A fine position also has the benefits, and the main one that I want to show is that we as Extinction Rebellion would retain a lot of control about what would be implemented. If we define very clearly that, let's say, 500 people should be on the Citizens' Assembly, and the government creates a Citizens' Assembly with 2 people on it, then we could say very clearly, okay, this is not what we define as a Citizens' Assembly, you're not fulfilling our demands. And this is important because we saw many times now in France and also in the UK that the government actually did implement a Citizens' Assembly, but really much weakened the ambition. For example, in France, where the Citizens' Assembly deliberates about climate change, but about with very little ambition. So there's the problem that governments might basically give into our demands, but weaken it. So we want to retain control, and this we can only do if we have a fine position. And of course, there's some kind of sweet spot in the middle, and this is the one that we have to find. Taking a bit of a step back, everything I said so far was only half of the story, because the Citizens' Assembly demand is very much, has 2 aspects. A literal meaning, this is what I mean with top-down, and this is everything I explained so far. The literal meaning of the Citizens' Assembly is that we want a national Citizens' Assembly that gives guidance or even is binding on the emergency response of our national government. And this is really much about the short-term response that we have to the climate ecological crisis. But the Citizens' Assembly demand also has an extended meaning or symbolic meaning, which is the idea of future of democracy or the renewal of democracy. And this idea of bottom-up change, of creating participatory democracy in all parts of society, is more bottom-up idea and is connected to these concepts of resilience, deep adaptation, and participatory democracy. For example, the climate crisis will create more and more conflicts, and we have to ready society by increasing its resilience so that it doesn't end up in conflicts, preventing social tipping points. And both aspects are important. We have to deal with both aspects of the Citizens' Assembly demand. So in the workshop that we want to do tomorrow, we will also talk about these 2 approaches. In the first workshop round, we want to talk really about the top-down approach, about citizens' assemblies, about what the 3 demands working group will be dealing with. And the goal of this workshop is to be very clear afterwards what we agree on, so what stands on the left side of the slides that I showed earlier, and what we don't agree on. And the ultimate goal is that we work out a foundational document, a bedrock document, so to say, on what we really can agree on. So after this workshop, we hopefully also have a process in place, or agree on a process on how we can shift everything that we don't agree on yet from the right side basically to the left side. That's the goal of the first workshop. And I attached to this video, like I put it in the links, 3 sources of documents that were worked out, for example, by Extra UK, but also here in the Netherlands, that show different levels of granularity, different proposals for citizens' assemblies, and it would be cool if you could still manage to at least skim through them before the meeting tomorrow. The second workshop round is about future of democracy, so the bottom-up part. And we have a little working group in there right now. It's Eva and me, but also a couple of people who are interested in this topic. And what we want to do in this workshop is not so much brainstorming about more ideas, because there are a lot of ideas out there how we can promote participatory democracy on all kinds of levels. But getting together with people who actually say, I want and I can commit time and energy, and this is what I will do in the next 3 months. So the goal of this workshop is really coming together with committed people who will take action and are willing to be held accountable also for taking these actions. A last thing that I just want to share is an example from Germany, because this is something that I personally think is another alternative way how we could create change in Extinction Rebellion. Not bottom up, not implemented by the national government, but also not top down, also not bottom up, in the sense of having decentralized citizens' assemblies. But we can really change democracy also in a much more radical way by organizing a citizens' assembly on national level that would deal with a national topic, and so basically take away legitimacy from the national government and just do it ourselves. They did this in Germany in a small scale. They had a citizens assembly on national level. It didn't have yet an impact like national legislations, but it already showed that decisions can be made next to the parliament, as you can see here. And especially now with the agenda ruling that massively undermines the legitimacy of the national government here in the Netherlands, or could undermine the legitimacy if we also push this narrative as Extinction Rebellion. There is a lot of space opening up right now for alternative modes of making national legislation-like decisions. So there is the possibility of creating a broad coalition society and organizing the citizens' assembly on national level, bottom up. And I just want to share this idea and to have this on our mind, and maybe we find some people who are passionate about this and push this. Yeah, see you tomorrow.